Hello. We continue with Hedda Gabler. Act 3 is, I think, the most impressive in the play. Here, Ibsen executes the turbulence and dramatic action with extraordinary compression and psychological complexity. In doing so, he makes us aware that the play is building toward what we might think of as a double tragedy, the destruction of both Hedda and Lovborg. The long night has passed that had begun in Act 2, and it's now morning at the beginning of Act 3. But Lovborg has not returned to escort Thea to her lodging as he had promised he would. Thea is in fact still awake, having waited anxiously for Lovborg overnight for at least 8 hours. Meanwhile, Hedda sleeps soundly, suggesting her confidence that she has now erased Thea's influence and a suggestion of her belief in her power to inspire and shape Lovborg in her own way. When Hedda awakens, she looks at her reflection in a hand mirror and arranges her hair in anticipation of Lovborg's return. But he arrives in a very different condition than she had expected, and he is preceded first by Tesman and then by Brock, both of whose explanations of the night shatter Hedda's hopes of molding Lovborg's destiny. Tesman reports that Lovborg, at the party, read him part of his manuscript, and he says, I believe it is one of the most remarkable things that has ever been written. In fact, this unpublished manuscript is so extraordinary that it makes Tesman envious. Well, Hedda likes the idea of Lovborg's genius, of course, but she has no interest in this particular work because she wasn't the one who inspired it. Thea was. But then Tesman describes what followed after this reading. Tesman says, I felt jealous of Eilert for having had it in him to write such a book. Only think, Hedda. Yes, I'm thinking. And then how pitiful to think that he, with all his gifts, should be irreclaimable after all. I suppose you mean that he has more courage than the rest. No, not that, Hedda. I mean that he's incapable of taking his pleasures in moderation. And what came of it all then, in the end? Well, to tell you the truth, I think it might be best described as an orgy, Hedda. Had he vine leaves in his hair? Vine leaves? No, I saw nothing of the sort, but he made a long rambling speech in honor of the woman who had inspired him in his work. That was the phrase he used. Did he name her? No, he didn't, but I can't help but thinking he meant Mrs. Esvelt. You may be sure he did. Now, Tesman's account of Lovborg's drunken conduct destroys the image that Hedda had been nurturing of him in two different ways. First, rather than proving that he could drink and still govern himself under that influence and under her inspiration, as Hedda had predicted, Lovborg instead merely became intoxicated, sloppy, and later staggered off, we learn, to another party at Mademoiselle Diana's brothel. Second, and more devastating in this report, is the fact that Lovborg's drunken, rambling tribute was not to Hedda as his inspiration, but rather to Thea as his muse behind the book from which he was reading. Later, Lovborg speaks of this work not simply as his own, but, quote, as my book and Thea's, for that's what it is. Indeed, he goes on to describe this unpublished manuscript as the child that they have produced between them. Well, Hedda hides her bitter disappointment at this moment, but when Tesman presents, quote, the precious, irreplaceable manuscript that Lovborg dropped on the street as he staggered from one orgy to another change comes over Hedda. Her frustrated urge to create now becomes a desire to destroy as her only expression of possible power. Now, Tesman anticipates, quote, the state of despair that Lovborg will surely experience when he wakes up and finds the manuscript he was carrying in his pocket is missing. And so, Tesman, despite his jealousy, plans to return the manuscript to Lovborg later that day. But when Tesman rushes off suddenly to the bedside of his dying aunt, Julia's sister, Hedda snatches the pages. For her, the carelessly lost manuscript signifies both Thea's power over Lovborg, since she helped to produce it, but also it signifies Loveborg's betrayal of her idea of him as the man she had inspired, one who would return with vine leaves in his hair, a conqueror, able to control his drinking and still be creative and commanding. Obviously, he didn't. Well, Brock's account of Loveborg's drunken antics at Madame Diana's later that night only heightens Hedda's disdain for him. Brock reports that Loveborg accused Diana's friends of robbing him of the manuscript, and in the violence that followed, he struck a policeman and was arrested. Now, this is just the kind of humiliation that Brock had wanted to inflict on Loveborg. We've seen that Hedda, by her own admission, fears scandal even more than she fears her stifling marriage and the prospect of motherhood. So when Brock tells her, quote, henceforth, as before, every respectable house will be closed to Eilert Loveborg, he makes it clear that surely Hedda now cannot associate with him anymore. Now remember that Brock saw Loveborg and Hedda earlier in Act 2 in intense communication, an intense connection glimpsed in the other room, and he wants to separate them in order to promote his own covert relationship with her. He sees Loveborg as a barrier there. Hedda had seemed receptive, however, to Brock's proposal of an affair before Loveborg's arrival. Brock fears after that she will not be. Now he responds at this point to coercion and to blackmail in order to ensure that Hedda will in fact accede to his sexual proposal. Having gotten Loveborg out of the way, he now reminds Hedda that he has power to ruin her reputation, not by revealing her wild past so much, but rather by suggesting that she allowed Loveborg to meet with the married Thea in her own house, thereby promoting an affair between Loveborg and a married woman. Well, beyond removing Loveborg as a sexual rival and ensuring that Hedda will comply with his erotic demands, Brock says this because he enjoys exercising power over her. Power over this woman, Hedda, who craves power herself and had earlier wanted to shoot him. Indeed, there's something of the sadist in Judge Brock, because the cruel exercise of power itself seems to give him a kind of erotic pleasure, as suggested in their conversation. Of Loveborg, Brock says, henceforth as before, every respectable house will be closed against him. And so ought mine, you mean? Hedda asks. Yes, I confess it would be more painful to me if this personage were to be made free in your house. He's superfluous. How intrusive he would be if he were to force his way into the triangle, Hedda asks. Precisely. It would simply mean that I should find myself homeless. Hedda looks at him with a smile. So you want to be the one cock in the basket? Is that your aim? Brock nods slowly and lowers his voice. Yes, that is my aim, and for that I will fight with every weapon I command. Hedda, her smile vanishing. I see you're a very dangerous person when it comes to the point. Do you think so? I'm beginning to think so, and I'm exceedingly glad to think that you have no sort of hold over me. Brock laughing equivocally. Well, Miss Hedda, perhaps you are right there. If I had, who knows what I might be capable of. To which Hedda says, Come, Judge Brock, that sounds almost like a threat. Brock says, rising. Oh, not at all. The triangle, you know, the triangle, which should be spontaneously constructed. Now, Brock's phrase, what I might be capable of, is clearly intended to strike fear into Hedda, and he succeeds. He is, as she puts it, all cock. That is to say, he feels entitled to enter any hen house and reign there in supreme dominion. But Brock is clearly an absolutely immoral individual, and that's what makes him capable of anything. Even though he says he's not threatening Hedda here, he obviously is threatening her, and he knows she knows that. And the terms of the threat are clear. She must give up any thoughts of Loveborg and comply with what Brock euphemistically calls their triangle. That is, carrying on an affair with Hedda under Tesman's nose while presenting himself as a friend of the family. When Lovborg finally rushes in, his words now too late are absolutely true. He is in despair over having lost the manuscript the previous night, and he's consumed with shame and self-hatred for his dissipated conduct the previous evening that caused the loss. Yet the twofold human destruction that follows from his arrival in Act 3 actually turns upon Hedda's behavior. Specifically, it turns upon her failure, deliberate failure, to inform Lovborg that Tesman has in fact retrieved the dropped manuscript and that she has the work in her possession. For Lovborg, the loss of this manuscript through drunkenness is the loss of self-confidence in himself, both as a writer and as a man. He tells Thea now that they must part. You can no longer be of service to me, he says, because I can no longer work. But what are we to make of Lovborg's false claim to Thea when he says, quote, I have torn the manuscript into 1,000 pieces. I have torn my life to pieces, so why should I not tear my life's work up? Now, when Thea says, in response, you have killed our child, why does Lovborg then reply, yes, it's a sort of child murder? Well, I think Lovborg has several motives for this lie, for claiming he destroyed the manuscript rather than losing it. First, Lovborg says he has destroyed the manuscript rather than losing it in order to drive Thea away for her own sake. He feels that he is worthless, disgraced, unworthy of her, and he does not want her to be tarnished by any further association with him because he knows that he has now humiliated himself and is socially persona non grata. When Hedda asks if he plans to escort Hedda home, Lovborg says, would you have people see her walking with me? Thea, in despair, says, I see nothing but darkness before me now. But Lovborg also lies about the manuscript because he's too ashamed to admit what really happened. He regards losing the precious text as a greater betrayal of Thea than destroying their work would have been. He can't bear to tell her that, quote, he lost our child in a night of riot and debauchery. He feels this is a double betrayal of Thea, both as his collaborator and as the woman who taught him sobriety, and so he cannot bring himself to acknowledge to her the truth of that double betrayal. But paradoxically, even Lovborg, as he feels himself unworthy of Thea, also resents her at the same time in this scene. He lies about the fate of the book then partly to punish Thea because he feels that she has failed him even as he has failed her. How? Well, remember that he began drinking when he learned that Thea had expressed concern to Hedda about his welfare, that she was worried about him. And now he feels sure that he will continue to drink because of her lack of faith at that moment. Thus, he says of his drinking now to her, it will not end. I know that perfectly well. And the thing is that now I have no taste for that sort of life either. I will begin it anew. She has broken my courage and my power of braving life out. Okay. The other life, the life of a writer, a sober writer, is beyond him now. He knows now that he will simply, in his own mind, continue down the path of dissipation. Well, note that Lovborg is at this point suicidal. He wants to die to escape his failure and his disgrace, and he tells Hedda that he, quote, plans to make an end of it all. Now, why doesn't Hedda then seize this opportunity to try again to shape Lovborg's life, especially after Thea has been cast off and has indeed walked out of the room? Why doesn't she now show him that she has the manuscript and make a new effort to revive their relationship and inspire it? Well, she continues to withhold it, primarily, I think, because she has given up hope in Lovborg. He has betrayed her through his weakness, his loss of self-control. He's fallen before the exalted idea that she had of him. He has not returned with vine leaves in his hair. She knows that now she could never inspire his intellectual creativity in the way that Thea has, but she also wants to destroy the evidence of that prior creativity. By keeping the recovered manuscript a secret, Hedda is also then punishing both Lovborg and Thea by keeping to herself this product of their own collaboration. Now, finally, I think Hedda continues to conceal the manuscript for her own self-protection. The disgraced Lovborg's very proximity to her in her house, and for that matter, the proximity of his unpublished book, is a potential threat to her reputation. He is at this point someone with whom no respectable member of society ought to associate. Well, Lovborg is, of course, tragically unaware of Hedda's dishonesty, and because he believes that the manuscript is lost forever, that he is forever disgraced, he wants only to die. And this declaration that he wants to put an end to it all gives Hedda a final opportunity, as she sees it, to shape a man's life, not by directing his creative efforts, but now by directing how Lovborg will end his life in a kind of artistic performance, a kind of performance art, if you will, using the pistol that she gives him, one of her father's pistols. Thus, she eagerly, ardently tells him how he must do it. Lovborg says, "I will only try to make an end of it all, and the sooner the better." Hedda, a step near him. "Eilert Lovborg, listen to me. Will you not try to do it beautifully? Beautifully? With vine leaves in my hair, as you used to dream of in the old days?" "Oh, no. I've lost my faith in the vine leaves," Hedda says. "But beautifully, nevertheless, for once, in a way. Goodbye, you must know. Do not come here any more." Again, she's afraid of scandal. Lovborg says, "Goodbye, Miss Tesman, and give George my love. He is on the point of leaving." Hedda says, "No, wait. I must give you a memento to take with you." She goes to the writing table and opens the drawer in the pistol case and returns to Lovborg with one of the pistols. He looks at her. Is this the memento?" Nodding slowly, Hedda says, "Do you recognize it? It was aimed at you once. You should have used it then. Take it, and you use it now." Lovborg puts the pistol in his breast pocket. "Thanks," he said, and beautifully, Lovborg, Hedda says, "promise me that you'll do it beautifully." Well, earlier Hedda had said that she could not bear sickness and death because they are almost ugly, almost always ugly. But she wants then to make Lovborg's death the creation of something beautiful, a creation of beauty in the act of his extinction. And because she is directing him to do it beautifully and giving him the implement to do it, she regards it as a kind of collaborative work of art, brought into being through his death. Only through the destruction of a man does she feel that she can now exercise her will and creative power. And if, after all, he kills himself, then Lovborg will have gone out at her direction, and he can no longer disillusion her by failing her in the future. Well, as Hedda sends the distraught and self-hating Lovborg off with her pistol, she urges him to regard this gun, one of two, as a memento of their emotional intimacy and to use it now, remembering her as he uses it in this act of what she hopes will be aesthetic suicide. But then, after he's gone, Hedda burns his manuscript in the stove in a moment of destructive perversity. By incinerating Lovborg's life's work and calling it sarcastically his child with Thea, Hedda is burning several things as well as the manuscript literally, things associated with this manuscript in her mind. First, she is burning Thea with her curly blonde locks that she had threatened to burn off before, the woman who inspired the work. Second, she is destroying Lovborg, who failed to live up to her ideal of him as a self-mastering genius with a wreath of vine leaves in his hair. And figuratively, finally, she is also burning the unwanted child that she is at this moment carrying by Tesman. Note that this is true. Instead of creating, ironically, a literary child with Lovborg, as Hedda had hoped, she has, to her horror, created somehow a real child with Tesman. Well, when Act 4 opens that evening, Hedda is dressed in black as she walks through the dark rooms. But unlike Julia and Tesman, Hedda's mourning clothes are not primarily for Aunt Rena, who has just died. Privately, Hedda is mourning Lovborg, and it is her own aesthetic gesture of commemorating and participating in what she regards as a beautiful death that she directed. She's wrong, of course. Hedda imagines that her words on parting so inspired Lovborg that he went immediately back to his rooms and shot himself in the temple with her pistol, that he ended his life with a kind of beautiful self-inflicted death as a tribute to her. But this fantasy of influencing Lovborg's death proves to be just as misguided as Hedda's earlier fantasy that Lovborg would return from Brock's party triumphant, confident in his self-control, and full of gratitude to her for inspiring that confidence. Again, she'll be disillusioned. Well, as Act 4 reveals, Hedda's extravagant fantasies of shaping a human life or a human death fall short, and they do so here in grotesque ways. As Hedda puts it later in the depths of her disillusionment, quote, "What curse is it that makes everything I touch turn ludicrous and mean?" Well, in Greek tragedy, the answer might be a supernatural curse. But in Hedda's case, what makes her incapable of shaping a man's life successfully, as she so desperately wants to, is her own frustrated urge to power, which seems in some way to ruin that possibility. What Hedda desires isn't just to inspire or to collaborate with a man, but rather, we realize, to control a man by enforcing her will on him. Now, it's an understandable urge, one might say in Hedda, to retaliation against patriarchy, which has enforced its restrictive will on Hedda as a woman most of her life. Well, when Hedda thinks of Lovborg's death, without knowing the sordid details, she reveals that beyond controlling his destiny by directing his death, she had also a vicarious motive as well. Remember that as a girl, Hedda took vicarious delight in the stories that Lovborg told her of his male escapades, and now she wants to experience, through Lovborg's suicide, as she imagines it, the rebellious freedom and courage that she has been unable to enact herself because of her fear of scandal. So when she speaks of what she hoped would happen, she puts it this way. She says, "Oh, what a sense of freedom it gives one, this act of Iwart Lovborg's." Brock says, "Freedom, Miss Hedda? Well, of course, it's a release for him." "No," Hedda says, "I mean for me. It gives me a sense of freedom to know that a deed of deliberate courage is still possible in this world, a deed of spontaneous beauty." Well, of course, Brock will tell her the truth a moment later. But there is something clearly deeply invested in her that wants to feel a sense of liberation through what she takes to be Lovborg's aesthetic suicide in this would-be act of courage. Unfortunately, Brock then reports the details of Lovborg's actual death, and this robs Hedda both of her belief in her shaping influence over him and also of the vicarious experience of freedom and courage and spontaneous beauty that she had wanted in hearing about it. None of that is possible. Now, even if Lovborg had acted and killed himself as Hedda urged, his suicide would hardly have been what she calls spontaneous. But the facts of his death, of course, as reported now, are much, much worse. Well, before we examine the terrible circumstances that will drive what she finds out that drive Hedda to commit suicide herself, the suicide that Lovborg could not, before we consider that, I want to look at the conversations leading up to this terrible news. First, Julia arrives, As she is mourning her sister, her words ironically recall Hedda's words to Lovborg. Julia says that Rena's end was so beautiful, and she says, I must prepare my dear one for her rest as well as I can. She shall go to the grave looking her best. Now, for all of their differences, Hedda and Julia both fetishize death and want to leave their beautifying influence on the deceased. But, unlike Hedda, who has nothing to live for, Julia still wants to live and wants to live for others. Indeed, Julia lives to be needed, and so Julia looks forward to the birth of the child that Hedda can't bear even to contemplate. Speaking of this, again, Julia is thrilled. She says, it's such an absolute necessity for me to have someone to live for. Well, heaven be praised, there may soon be something in this house, too, to keep an old aunt busy. Hedda says, oh, don't trouble yourself with anything here. But then Tesman says, yes, just fancy it. What a nice time we three might have together, all sitting around, waiting for the baby to come. This, of course, turns Hedda's stomach. Tesman's image of Julia spending time with him and Hedda in her confinement as a kind of threesome reminds us of another triangle that looms in Hedda's future as well, and that is the sexual arrangement, the triangle that Brock has proposed and that he presented to Hedda with increasing coercion. Hedda realizes that both of these triangles would be forms of constriction, and she is already hemmed in by her status as the wife of a dull husband and by bourgeois domesticity and by what she has come to realize will be a life less extravagant than the one she had demanded. When Tesman asks for the manuscript so that he can return it to Lovborg, Hedda cannot now produce it. She's cornered, and she is throughout the play, but especially in Act 4. Her only recourse is to admit that she burned the manuscript, but to claim that she did so for Tesman's sake. Consider this exchange between them when she presents this startling news. Tesman says asks, where is the manuscript? And she replies, I have burnt it, every line of it. Tesman, with a violent movement of terror, burnt, Aylward's manuscript? Don't scream so. The servant might hear you. Burnt? What? Good God, no, it's impossible. It is so, nevertheless. Do you know what you've done, Hedda? It's unlawful appropriation of lost property. Fancy that. Just ask Judge Brack, and he'll tell you what it is. I'd advise you not to speak of it, either to Judge Brack or anyone else, Hedda replies. But how could you do something so unheard of? What put it into your head? What possessed you? Answer me, eh? Hedda, suppressing an almost imperceptible smile, says, I did it for your sake, George. For my sake? This morning, when you told me about it, that you had he'd read it to you. Yes, and what then? You acknowledged that you'd envied him and his work. Oh, of course, I didn't mean that literally. Well, no matter. I could not bear the idea that one should throw you into the shade. Tesman, in an outburst of mingled doubt and joy, says, Hedda, oh, is this true? But I never knew you to show your love like that before. Fancy that. To which Hedda then says, well, I may as well tell you that just at this time, impatiently breaking up. No, can't you ask Aunt Joy? She'll tell you fast enough. Oh, I think I almost understand you, Hedda. Clasping his hands together, Tesman says, great heavens, do you really mean it, eh? Don't shout, the servant might hear. Oh, but the servant, how absurd you are, Hedda. It's only my old Berta. Well, I'll tell Berta myself, Hedda, clenching her hands together in desperation. Oh, it is killing me, all of this. What is, Hedda, what is? Hedda, coldly controlling herself. All of this absurdity, George. Now, it's distressing that Tesman, in this scene, is so willing to accept Hedda's lie and to forgive the destruction of what he regarded as a transformative work for the human race just because he thinks that Hedda is beginning to show loyalty and affection to him. All of the importance of the work, all of the legal danger Hedda might be in seem eclipsed by the fact that she's doing it, she claims, for his sake. Little does he realize the manuscript, of course, meant something very different to her. Well, realizing that Tesman will conceal her crime, Hedda is so relieved that she has swallowed her claim that she burned it for his sake, that she's on the brink of telling him that she's pregnant. Thinking about it a moment later, however, the horror makes her break off, especially when she sees that Tesman has picked up on what she's suggesting and is thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father and wants even to tell the servants. Well, at this moment, Hedda clenches her hands in rage and frustration as she had in Act 1 and says, "It's killing me, all of this absurdity." What does all of this include for her? Well, even if, as Hedda imagines at this point, Lovborg has killed himself as a tribute to her influence, she must still go on living an absurd life as a woman, a domestic. She must live a life of boredom. She must live in a state of depression, stifling domestic comfort, unwanted motherhood. That is the all of this. That is the absurdity she's alluding to, even if she succeeded in directing Lovborg's death. But Hedda's sense of futility becomes even more unbearable when Thea comes in and brings the rumor of Lovborg's wounding, and Brock then describes the tawdry circumstances surrounding it. Thea first raises this concern when she says, no, I'm sure that it was him that they were talking about, someone going to a hospital, and I just heard something about the hospital. Tesman says, "The hospital? Oh, yes, I'm in such mortal terror." A little bit later, Brock says, "Well, I regret to say Albert Lovborg has indeed been taken to the hospital, and he's lying at the point of death." Thea says, "Oh God, oh God." "To the hospital," Tesman says, "at the point of death?" Hedda involuntarily says then, "So soon then? So soon?" Now, note that the news that Lovborg was taken to a hospital distresses Hedda at first because it indicates that he did not succeed in killing himself with a single shot to the temple as a kind of grand final gesture, that he may in some way have botched this supposed work of art. Yet Hedda is thrilled that Lovborg acted directly, she thinks, on her injunction that he should immediately go and shoot himself after leaving her. Thus the phrase, "so soon then," as she puts it. That part seems to gratify her. Yes, he followed my orders. In fact, Hedda is so determined to take credit for Lovborg's shooting that she carelessly gives herself away to Brock by announcing that she's sure that Lovborg shot himself, even before that has been indicated, even before Brock tells her that he did in fact shoot himself using one of her pistols. Well, even if Lovborg didn't shoot himself as beautifully as she had hoped, at this point, Hedda still clings to the idea that he acted under her influence and that by using her pistol, he made his death a kind of tribute to her inspiring influence. Now we're told that when she hears about it, she takes a kind of pride. Brock says, "I only know that he was found. He had shot himself in the breast." Hedda says, "Oh, how terrible that he should die like that." Hedda to Brock, "Was it in the breast?" "Yes, as I told you." "Not in the temple?" "No, in the breast." Well, the breast is just as good a place too," Hedda says. Yes. And then Hedda says, "You know," in a clear voice, "at last, a deed worth doing." Tesman says, "Good heavens, Hedda, what are you saying?" "I say there is beauty in it," still trying to believe in that beauty that she imparted to him. Now, a moment later, however, Brock soon dispels Hedda's final illusions about Lovborg's would-be suicide as an act of freedom and courage and beauty done under her influence. Everything Brock reports wounds Hedda. Far from wanting to kill himself, as Hedda had directed, it turns out that Lovborg had wanted to live and to recover the manuscript, which took him to Diana's. And far from being beautiful, his death was ugly and grotesque because it wasn't deliberately self-inflicted. The gun either accidentally discharged or was fired during a struggle with Mademoiselle Diana. And the bullet entered not even in his breast, as was first reported, but rather his bowels, messily. And finally, far from paying homage to Hedda as he was struggling to find the manuscript, he was paying tribute to Thea by speaking even then of this manuscript he was seeking as the lost child he was trying to recover. In short, everything about the actual conditions of his wounding and death are a complete abrogation of what Hedda had intended and hoped. Well, to make Hedda's agony still more intense, the child that she jealously thought she had destroyed when she burned Lovborg's work may yet be reborn under new hands. Thea again plays the role of muse here, that role in which Hedda has now failed 3 times, first as a teenager, then as a woman the night before sending him off to Brock's, and then as a woman sending him off to what she hoped would be a beautiful suicide. Failed in all of them. So instead, Thea now joins with Tesman in a long-term plan and tribute to Lovborg to recreate from the notes that she has been carrying around Lovborg's work. This bundle of notes that she has carried with her like something sacred, she thinks perhaps with Tesman they might piece together. Tesman says, to think Eilert going out of the world in this way, not leaving behind him the book that would have immortalized his name. Thea says, oh, if only it could be put together again. Yes, if only it could. I don't know what I would not give. She says, well, wait, perhaps it can. Perhaps it can, Mr. Tesman. What do you mean? Thea searches in the pockets of her dress. Look here. I have kept all the loose notes he used to dictate from. Oh, well, perhaps if we two put our heads together. Oh, yes, at least we can try. Yes, we'll manage it, says Tesman. We must. I'll dedicate my life to the task. To which he says, I owe this to Eilert's memory. Yes. This, too, subverts and defeats Hedda's intentions. Now, Thea, again, despite her hyper-feminine appearance and blonde hair, is again shown to be a creature capable of creative collaboration with a man, even a rather timid and tepid man like Tesman, and that she's capable of working with and inspiring a man in a way that Hedda is manifestly not. Hedda passes her hands through Thea's hair at this point in what is surely a kind of bitter amazement at this, that this woman, not me, is now working with and fortifying and inspiring my dull husband. Well, the attempt of Thea and Tesman to recreate the child that Thea and Lovborg produced is more than Hedda can bear. She feels now utterly defeated in every possible way. Hedda says, fancy that, pause, passing her hands softly through Thea's hair. Doesn't it seem strange to you, Thea? Here are you sitting with Tesman, just as you used to sit with Eilert Lovborg. Thea says, if I could only inspire your husband in the same way. Hedda says, oh, that will come too in time, she feels sure. Tesman then says, yes, do you know, Hedda, I really think I begin to feel something of that sort, a kind of inspiration. But won't you go and sit with Judge Brock again? Hedda says, is there nothing I can do to help you two? Tesman replies, no, nothing in the world. Nothing. Now, you'll note that Thea is helping to create, while Hedda finds that she can't even succeed in exerting her will to destroy. Rather than empowering her, Hedda's attempts to eliminate Lovborg and his work have backfired and thus exacerbated her sense of futility here. Now Hedda has absolutely nothing to live for and every reason to die. She can help no one. She can influence no one. But in order to take her own life, Hedda must overcome what she has referred to more than once as her inherent cowardice, specifically her fear of scandal, which self-inflicted death would carry in the public mind, the scandal that would follow her death and be part of her reputation. Now, it's clear that Hedda is nonetheless contemplating suicide when she takes what Ibsen refers to as an object from under the bookcase and covers this pistol with sheet music and retreats into the back room where the piano now sits. But what pushes Hedda to death and the enactment of this death wish is the realization that she would also face a threatened scandal even if she lives. Brock, who has police informants, of course, knows that the discharged gun that wounded and then finally killed Loveborg was hers. And Brock indicates that he will remain silent about her incriminating ownership of the pistol only so long as Hedda complies with his sexual demands. Otherwise, he can and will expose her as an accessory in Loveborg's death. Brock says, the police have the gun. What will the police do with it? Search till they find the owner. Do you think they will succeed? Brock bends over and whispers, no, Hedda Gabler, not so long as I say nothing. Hedda looks frightened at him. And if you do not say nothing, what then? Brock shrugs his shoulder. Well, there's always the possibility that the pistol was stolen. Hedda, death rather than that. Brock smiling. People say such things, but they don't do them. Hedda replies then, are you supposing the pistol was not stolen and that the owner is discovered? What then? Well, Hedda, then comes the scandal. The scandal? Yes, the scandal of what you are mortally afraid. Now, will you answer one question for me? Why did you give Albert Loveborg the pistol? And what conclusions will people draw from the fact that you did give it to him? Well, he has absolutely framed her. Now, you'll note that the naive Tesman supports the idea of Judge Brack coming every day to keep Hedda company while he works with Thea just to entertain her, absolutely unaware of what Brock has suggested. But in this passage, we see the demonstration of Brock's power in a way that completely overwhelms Hedda, terrifies her with his ability to incriminate her as one who gave Loveborg the gun and will ruin her social reputation. This woman who craves freedom and craves power has now never been more trapped or more powerless. Well, as the play moves to its conclusion, to the climax, you'll note that the word nothing that we've found in the passages I've just read is often repeated. Nothing expresses the condition of Hedda's existence. When she asks desperately if she can assist Tesman and Thea with their work, she says, is there nothing I can do? And Tesman says, no, nothing in the world. When Hedda retreats to the back room just before shooting herself, she sits down at the piano that had been prominently displayed in the parlor in Act 1. Its disappearance thereafter suggests that that piano can't any longer provide Hedda with any sense of creative power or any freedom at all. But the piano and the pistols are, after all that she has. Now, we're told in the stage directions, Hedda is heard playing a wild dance on the piano. She plays the piano in a kind of frenzy that seems intended to channel all of her rage, all of her inner turbulence, all of her horror at what her life is. But Hedda isn't playing this music as an alternative to shooting herself. No, she has taken the remaining pistol, remember, the one she did not give to Loveborg, with her and plans to use it in this back room. The music she's playing on the piano is meant as a kind of aesthetic prelude, a performance that will frame her death as a defiant work of art. She stops when the always respectable Tesman says that the music is loud and asks her not to play dance music on the night when two people, his aunt and Loveborg, have died. Hedda replies, after this, I'll be quiet. It's her farewell. She closes the curtain and shoots herself in the temple where she had wanted Loveborg to shoot himself. Well, as in Greek tragedy, we don't witness this act, but only the aftermath. Consider Hedda's final words and how she stages her death, not merely as an escape from the burden of living, but as a final would-be artistic form of self-expression. Brock calls out gaily from his armchair, yes, Hedda, as Tesman says, we'll be together every blessed evening with all the pleasure in life. We shall get on capitally together, we two. Hedda, speaking from the back room loud and clear, says, Yes, don't flatter yourself we will, Judge Brock. Now that you are the one cock in the basket. A shot is heard from within. Tesman, Miss Esveld, and Brock leap from their seats. Tesman says, Oh, now she's playing with those pistols again, and he pulls back the curtains and runs in, followed by Thea. Hedda lies stretched on the sofa, lifeless. Confusion and cries. Berta enters in alarm. Tesman shrieks to Brock, Shot herself! She shot herself in the temple! Fancy that! To which Brock, half fainting in the armchair, replies, Good God, people don't do such things. Well, Hedda kills herself exactly as she had wanted and envisioned Lovborg would, firing into her brain and dying instantly in an act of defiance. Defiance against a life she cannot bear, but more than that, her final mocking words to Brock are part of that pointed defiance against him. Now you're the one cock in the basket. She quotes his earlier words and challenges his claim that she would be together with him in a cozy way thereafter. Don't be so sure. Clearly now those words, you're the one cock in the basket, take on a very different meaning because she won't be in the basket with him. So he shouldn't flatter himself with such an idea. Well, Hedda's final mocking cry of protest is not just against Brock and not just against life as she has been forced to endure it, but also against patriarchy at large, against the social conventions that Hedda has heretofore feared violating because they would be scandalous. Now she openly defies those conventions and accepts the consequences of scandal. She won't be around to endure it, but she doesn't seem to care about the effect on her reputation. Ironically, then, in doing this, in defying her fears, Hedda achieves a transgressive power at the moment of her death that she never had while she was alive. And we see the effect of this power that she has in killing herself immediately. Brock is so astounded that we're told he half faints and falls back into the armchair. This man who exerted power over Hedda now seems shocked and physically weakened by her death. He's confounded because she's now beyond his control and authority. His cry, people don't do such things, expresses his disbelief. Hedda's act of self-destruction proves that Brock's statement is a lie. Driven to certain pitches of boredom, suppression and desperation and unhappiness, Ibsen suggests a few brave individuals like Hedda do such things, can take their own lives. Well, suicide is Hedda's only definitive act of freedom in the entire play. But here's the question that readers and viewers face, I think, at the end of this play. Do the oppressive conditions that led to Hedda's suicide, after she had tried to overcome them, establish sufficient sympathy to make her death truly tragic? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this at the start of our Zoom session on Friday. And a second question is this. Does Ibsen intend a double tragedy here, Hedda's and Lovborg's, as Racine, say, does with Phaedra and Hippolytus? Or does Lovborg fail to mount the kind of heroic resistance to the conditions of his life that we associate with tragic figures? Okay. Now, we turn to Riders of the Sea, a one-act tragedy by John Millington Synge. And in doing so, we enter the 20th century. Synge was an Irishman who studied music in Germany and languages in Paris before returning to Ireland to begin his literary career. He settled in Dublin, but the inspiration for his plays didn't come from the Irish capital, which was the site of works by his towering contemporary James Joyce. No, instead, Synge drew his inspiration from the rural folk in the extreme west of Ireland, the country's wildest, most primitive region that encompasses Connemara and County Mayo. When Synge first ventured there in the early 20th century, much of the peasant population of fishermen and small farmers still spoke primarily Irish, though they also spoke a kind of lyrical dialect-infused English that he found fascinating. Well, Synge went there at the urging of the great and influential Irish poet William Butler Yeats, who was himself fascinated with the region, a region rich in imagination in the inhabitants, fascinating because of their unique style of speech, but also because of their folk superstitions and the legends, the myths that developed over centuries in this poor, isolated, but stunningly beautiful region of rocky land and plunging bays. Yeats believed that Irish writers should look to their own native culture for literary material, and so he directed Synge, at the age of 27, to spend some time on one of the 3 Aran Islands, which are off the coast of Western Ireland. Synge stayed on an island called Inishmaan, off and on, for several years. I was once, it's a kind of outcropping in the Atlantic, less than a mile wide. Many years ago, I visited that island myself and was marooned there for about 3 days because the captain of the small boat that took me there was sleeping off a night of extremely heavy drinking at a pub back on the mainland. Well, Synge became fascinated on Inishmaan, both with the rhythms of native speech and by the way of life of the fishermen, largely fishermen, who lived there on this island. And that is where he sets, on Inishmaan, Riders of the Sea, which he wrote in 1902. Now, Synge spent almost 4 years there, collecting stories and folklore, and he used them not just in Riders to the Sea, but in another one-act tragedy that he wrote the same year, The Shadow of the Glen, about an unfaithful wife in this remote community. That play drew the wrath of conservative Irish critics who accused Synge of defaming Irish womanhood by choosing such a subject, an unfaithful woman. But this was merely a prelude to the most famous controversy that surrounded Synge's work. The real furor in Ireland swirled around his masterpiece, one that I hope you will read sometime, The Playboy of the Western World, which was first performed at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin in 1907, after 6 years during which he wrote and rewrote it. It's not a tragedy, but a dark comedy about a man named Christy Mahone, who thinks he's murdered his abusive father with a spade and uses that story of patricide to gain fame, popularity, and favor from a pub keeper's daughter in a remote Irish village, until the old man unexpectedly comes back, bloodied, but still alive. Unlike Riders to the Sea, that play is set on the mainland, not on Inishmaan, but in another remote area. Also, unlike Riders to the Sea, Synge satirizes in it familiar aspects of the Irish character, the stereotypical Irishman as drunken, whimsical, and superstitious. But the play hints at an underlying power and even heroic potential in its protagonist, something that most of those who saw it when it opened in Dublin certainly did not recognize, because when it opened, it was met with howls of derision and protest. It caused what came to be known as the Playboy Riots. These began on opening night when Dublin's Catholic middle-class audience tried to storm the stage at the Abbey and threw objects at the actors. The police had to be summoned to quell the mayhem. What triggered this violent protest seems innocent and trivial today. Believe it or not, the actual trigger in Act 3 was Christie's use of the word shift. It refers to a woman's slip or undergarment, and the word sparked a powder keg of outrage that had been building in the audience since the start of the play. The largely male audience revered the idea of Irish female purity, as well as the idea of the uncorrupted vitality of the rural folk in the West, and Synge's satire challenged both of those ideals, and middle-class Dublin never forgave him for it. Unfortunately, Synge died of an inoperable tumor just 2 years after the Playboy Riots, and just shy of his 38th birthday. Now, while Playboy of the Western World draws on the abundant comedy that Synge saw in the lives of Irish peasants, Riders to the Sea, on the other hand, reveals his understanding that these obscure lives can also support tragedy. Like Bicknor, he defies the idea that tragedy requires figures of prominence, as Aristotle had insisted. No. Synge demonstrates that our sympathetic identification, our pity and fear, can arise from the struggles and the losses of a peasant family of fishermen on a remote island. What he gives us, as Lorca does in Blood Wedding we'll see, is essentially a folk tragedy. It opens with Mara and her two daughters, Kathleen and Nora, in their cottage, awaiting news about the fate of one of Mara's two remaining sons, the fate of Michael, who has failed to return from fishing some days earlier and is now assumed to have drowned. Mara goes out each day to scan the sea, not for his fishing boat, but rather for his body, which she expects or hopes will wash up on the shore. It's clear that Michael is lost, but it's uncertain at the beginning of the play whether a bundle of clothing that the local priest has received and given to Nora were Michael's or some other drowned man's. The shirt and the stocking were taken from some drowned bodies in the waters to the north off the coast of County Donegal. Well, before opening the package containing these clothes, the daughters need to hide it from their sleeping mother, Mora, because they're afraid that if she sees them opening the bundle, the final confirmation of Michael's death would just destroy her. Now, she has lost so many other men that they fear that this will simply be too much. The priest advises that Kathleen and Nora tell their mother about the clothing only if they belong to Michael's, and then try to comfort her with the news that at least her son's body got what he calls a clean burial, that is, a Christian burial on the Donegal mainland. But he says if the clothes aren't Michael's, then he suggests you should not mention the bundle you got received from me at all, because the failure to find his body will only increase Mora's anxiety. As the priest puts it, she'll be getting her death with crying and lamenting. So either way then, the contents of the package can only increase Mora's heartbreak, either by confirming her loss or by prolonging her grief about the missing body. When Nora and Kathleen do open the package, they discover the flannel stitching matches the other clothing, the remaining clothing, and Michael's in the cottage. But even without knowing about this matching, Mora is already certain that he is dead. It's not just Michael's failure to return home that convinces her. It is the succession of deaths that preceded it, the deaths that she has suffered before, her husbands, her father-in-laws, and her sons, all of whom rode down to the sea and then never returned again. As she enumerates it, she says, I've a husband and a husband's father and 6 sons in this house, 6 fine men, though it was a hard birth I had with every one of them, and they're coming into the world, and some of them were found and some of them were not found, but they're all gone now, the lot of them, all gone. One thing that distinguishes this play from most others we've read is that the primary tragic figure, Mara, isn't one who dies, but rather who is doomed to go on living and grieving and suffering. And therein lies her tragedy. Now, Mora's years of grieving have given her, not surprisingly, a sense of fatality, a sense of destiny. And in this play, the roaring sea is that force of destiny, as if it was invested, the sea, with a kind of malign power that has robbed her of her husband, father-in-law, and 6 sons. Well, Mara has a powerful and ultimately accurate premonition that her one remaining son, her youngest, Bartley, will die in the sea if he tries as planned to cross to the mainland, to Connemara, in order to sell a horse at a fair in the town of Galway. So she voices her dread to him and pleads with Bartley not to go in various ways. She says, it's hard set will be surely the day you're drowned with the rest. What will I live and the girls with me, and I an old woman looking for the grave? Well, for Mara, Bartley's fate is, as she calls it, hard set. It's preordained. If he tries to cross the sea to get to the mainland, he will die. He will drown. The sea seems to want only the young, not the old. So in this strange and isolated place, there's a perverse inversion of what ought to be the natural order in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, the old die and leave their things to the young. Here, the young die and leave their things to the old, like Michael's stick. Taking the stick that Nora gave her, Mara says, In the big world, the old people do be leaving things after them for their sons and children, but in this place, it is the young men do be leaving things behind for them that do be old. And she takes the stick with her. It goes out. Now, Mara knows that the sea will claim her sons then, if he enters it, but she can do nothing to stop him from going any more than she could stop her other sons or her husband from going out fishing to earn a living in their small wooden carracks. In this case, she can't stop Bartley from venturing off the island to trade. The young men of the island, especially Bartley, her youngest, clearly feel stifled there and long to get away whenever they can. And the fair in Galway presents an opportunity for that escape. Mara wants the local priest to stop Bartley from going, but the priest, like religion itself in this place, seems entirely ineffectual. The priest says he won't intervene. So when Bartley is preparing to leave with a piece of rope to tether the horse, Mara urges him in various ways to stay. She urges him to stay, if only so that the rope will remain in the house, because both the rope and he are going to be necessary, she says, to bury Michael's body when it washes up. It'll be required to lower his body into the coffin. It will be wanting in this place, I'm telling you, if Michael's washed up tomorrow morning and the next morning and the morning and then a week, it will need a deep grave we'll need to make for him by the grace of God, to which Bartley says, no, I must go now quickly. There's only one boat going for 2 weeks, and I must catch it. He simply resists this appeal. Note that when Bartley refuses, Mara then asks him to weigh his interest in buying horses against her love for him and need for him to stay alive as her only son. If it was 100 horses or 1,000 horses, you had it yourself. What is the price of 1,000 horses against a son where there is but one son only? Well, this is an appeal to guilt. Just as before, it was an appeal to family responsibility to help bury your brother, and this too fails. It's no more persuasive. As Bartley assures her, no, I'll be back, you can be sure, in just a few days. Bartley doesn't share his mother's sense of destiny at all, despite the death of his father and brothers. I'll have half an hour to go down, and you'll see me come again in 2 days or 3 days or maybe 4 days if the wind is bad. Ha. Well, the rope that Bartley takes with him seems then a kind of symbol of his fated death. But it becomes an implement that will be used not in Michael's burial, not, if you will, in Michael's death, but rather in his own. Its associations with death fall upon him. Now, as he is riding the horse on his red horse with the gray pony tied to the rope, we learn later that the pony is startled and knocks Bartley off his red horse, and he falls into the sea and is then pulled out before his body is recovered. It's a death that I hope recalled to you Hippolytus's in Phaedra, not just because of the horses and their role in it, but also because the sea here, as in Phaedra, seems to be invested with a kind of malignant power to destroy. Well, after Mara has failed to compel Bartley to stay, Kathleen invokes a local superstition. He's just gone off, and she tells her mother it's unlucky to send a man off to sea with harsh words, and so she urges Mara to run down and meet Bartley on his way to the shore in order to bless him and give him a slice of bread for his journey. When Mara returns with the bread, she's even more certain than before that her youngest son is doomed, that like Michael's and the other, he is about to die at sea. Nora asks, "Tell us what you've seen." "Ah," she says, "I went down to the spring well and I stood there saying a prayer to myself. Then Bartley came along, and he's riding on the red mare with the gray pony behind him." She puts her hands as if to hide her eyes. "Oh, Son of God, spare us, Nora. What was what you saw?" "I seen Michael himself," Kathleen speaking softly. "You did not, Mother. It wasn't Michael. You seen his body is after being found from the far north, and he's got a clean burial by the grace of God." Mara, a little defiantly, "I'm after seeing him this day, and he's riding and galloping. Bartley came first on the red mare, and I tried to say, 'God speed you,' but something choked the words in my throat, and he went by quickly. 'And the blessing of God on you,' said he, and I could say nothing. And I looked up then, and I crying at the gray pony, and there was Michael upon it, with the fine clothes on him and the new shoes on his feet. Kathleen begins to keen. It's destroyed we are from this day. It's destroyed we are. Mara has a vision of the recently deceased Michael, whose clothes, you remember, the clothes in which he died, were taken from the drowned corpse. But in this prophetic vision, Michael appears to be a kind of well-dressed ghost, perhaps the clothes in which he was buried, as if the ghost of Michael has now returned to earth to bring his brother Bartley to the afterlife with him. They ride one after the other in Mara's vision toward the sea, that is, toward death. Now, Mara's belief in ghosts is rooted in local folklore, and this superstition exists in this curious world side by side with her deep Catholic faith. Mara says, there does be a power of young men floating round in the sea. She means specifically that according to local superstition, the spirits of the unburied, those who are lost at sea, were believed to be able to roam the mortal world, as she imagines Michael's is now. And yet, her daughter is at pains to tell her, actually Michael's body has been found and buried in Donegal, we know now, so it isn't out floating in the sea. Now, that seems to cast perhaps some doubt on the folk superstition, but not entirely, because Mara's vision is so chilling that it convinces even the more skeptical and rational-minded Kathleen that Bartley will indeed surely die. Because he's the one male who is still alive to run the farm, Kathleen says, yes, it's destroyed we all are. Yes, she now is as convinced as her mother of his doom, and they'll have no man around. Now, in Mara's vision, you remember, her sons are riding two horses, okay, linked by a rope. First she sees Bartley riding, and then on the gray horse she sees the ghost of her recently deceased son. Now, the rope that links these two horses in life, and also in her vision, is clearly the play's richest symbol. Before departing, Bartley, recall, takes this rope, and fashions a halter to put around the neck of the gray pony as he's leading it, riding it, and it trails behind him and his mare as he rides down to the pier to catch the boat. He intends to sell the gray pony. When he fashions this halter, his hope in using the rope is as a form of control over the pony. That is, the rope becomes a kind of manifestation or symbol of his belief in his own free will, his ability to control. Mara says, you remember, that they need the rope at home because they'll have to use it to lower Michael's body into a deep grave after his body washes up on shore, which it never does, of course. For her, then, the rope is linked with the inevitability of death and with forces beyond her control, the very opposite of the freedom that Bartley associates with the rope as a form of personal control. Now, the fact that this rope connects Bartley to the pony being ridden in Mara's vision by his dead brother, the pony that knocks against him and thus knocks him into the sea, that image of the two of them riding one after the other, yoked by a rope, reinforces Mara's view of the rope as a symbol of human impotence. It seems to doom one brother, the living brother, to the death of the other as he rides behind him in this ghostly way. Indeed, we learn that according to a witness, the pony that was attached by this rope, quote, knocked Bartley into the sea, and he was washed out where there is a great surf on the white rocks. So ironically, then, it is not Michael's body that at the very end washes up on shore at the end of the play, but rather it is Bartley's. And their fates seem connected, bound together in a kind of common destiny of death, as if by a rope, just as the horses they ride are connected by this rope. Now, Mara knows from experience that she has no power either to keep her men at home or to save their lives if they go off. And she is by no means unique in this. Rather, Synge suggests that what we get in this play is a repetition of a scene that Mara and other mothers have had for centuries with their sons. He presents a kind of eternal struggle between young men who want to exercise what they think is their freedom by entering the sea and moving away, and women who want to preserve them and keep them alive at home. In this respect, the characters in the play are more prototypical than they are individual. Now, in addition to the vision of her dead son riding behind Bartley, Mara is also certain that she'll never see Bartley again because of a specific memory. While he was an infant, sitting in her lap, the villagers, years before, brought in the drowned body of an older son named Patch. There was Patch, afterwards drowned out of the carrack that turned over. I was sitting here with Bartley, and he a baby, lying on my 2 knees, and I see 2 women and 3 women and 4 women coming in, and they're crossing themselves and not saying a word. I looked out then, and there were men coming after them, and they holding up a thing and a half and a red sail, and water dripping out of it. It was a dry day, Nora, and leaving a track by the door. Yes, it was carried in that sail, the body of her son, Patch. Now, as with the vision of Michael's ghost, we might be inclined to view this coincidence of the body of Patch coming in while she sat with the youngest child in her lap, and the sense of doom that it confers on this youngest child. We might regard that as merely a piece of folk superstition. But again, the fact is that it proves to be genuinely prophetic, because moments later, a group of men bring in Bartley's dripping body, covered as Patch's had been by a piece of sail. The enormity of the loss of this last youngest son fills Mara with a combination of grief and relief, what she calls, quote, a great rest. She now finds relief only in the realization she has no more men to lose at sea, and their deaths now combine to form a single loss as Mara drops Michael's clothes near Bartley's feet as if their deaths were simply one and the same. We're told now that as she looks down on her youngest and drops Michael's clothes there, sprinkles holy water over him, it isn't that I haven't prayed for you, Bartley, to the Almighty God. It isn't that I haven't said prayers in the dark night till you wouldn't know what I was saying, but it's great rest I'll have now. Great rest. One can understand the relief that this woman, who has no more men to lose, feels, having dreaded their losses one by one, and then suffered those losses. But it is harder to grasp Mara's affirmation of Christian faith at this moment in a God who continually denies her prayers. Consider the end of the play. Mara says they're all together this time, and the end is come, the end of any future losses. May the Almighty God have mercy on Bartley's soul and on Michael's and on the souls of Seamus and Patch and Stephen and Sean bending her head. And may he have mercy on my soul too, Nora, and on the soul of everyone living in the world. And then she continues, Michael has a clean burial in the far north by the grace of the Almighty God. Bartley will have a fine coffin out of the white boards and the deep grave. Surely, what more can we want than that? No man at all can be living forever, and we must be satisfied. She kneels down, and the curtain slowly falls. Well, you remember earlier in the play, the priest said that Mara shouldn't be afraid for Bartley's voyage because, quote, Almighty God won't leave her destitute without a living son. Well, he was clearly wrong. Nora mentions this after Mara describes her vision, but the priest was incorrect. He was short-sighted. His belief that God would not deprive her of her last child was inaccurate. Similarly, now, the God that Mara invokes at the end of this play seems anything but merciful. He's either non-existent or impotent or completely indifferent to human misery. There's no sense of a divine intervention in any respect. Sing clearly, I think, wants the audience to ponder the glaring disconnection between Mara's prayers that she has, as she points out, been saying for many, many years, and the terrible outcomes, the way in which those prayers are not answered. Yet, rather than questioning or challenging the God that she worships, Mara ends the play by thanking him as she kneels in prayer. To be satisfied with her existence, as she now drearily says she is, as she describes it, is a satisfaction rooted in the renunciation of all desire. To be satisfied with nothing on earth and to view early death as a kind of blessing, the best one can hope for, is possible only if you've lost absolutely everything, and that is the case. Thus, she now feels something she has not been able to feel when she still had a living husband or living children. She had then wanted to hold on to her men, and when she lost them, she mourned them. Now, instead, her resignation to loss has taken her, it seems, beyond any personal will and beyond any personal desire, because in this depth of tragedy, she has found a peculiar relief in the knowledge she has nothing more to lose, and yet, curiously and perversely, thanks the God who deprived her of those loved ones for now delivering her to this state of surrender.